Greetings. This lecture is on employee discipline, specifically how we manage disciplinary issues. Now, disciplinary issues are a form of performance management, but we don't focus on the job performance of the employee with respect to their tasks. What we are focusing on is how well they follow company rules and policies. And so when they don't follow the company rules and policies as outlined in the employee manual, we need to intervene to get them back on track to perform the way we want them to perform. So it's a subset of performance management, but it specifically deals with rule violations on the job. This slide is a great example of the different types of misconduct or violations you might see on the job. Minor violations might include excessive absenteeism. Absenteeism in and of itself is not a problem, but when it becomes excessive or it's for without cause, that becomes an issue. But hygiene could be an issue. Dress code violations are an issue. Smoking rules, horseplay, tardiness, all those things. These are minor issues, but they need to be addressed because there can be issues of safety at risk here. I probably would disagree with the slide that says the safety rule violation is a minor issue. I think they can be a major serious issue, and certainly if we're telling people or encouraging people to not work safely, as we know, this could be a liability issue for the organization. So I would agree with this list, except for the fact that I would put the safety rule violation under the category of something more serious, because we really do want to make sure that our employees are working as safely as possible. But other things that are in the serious level would be dishonesty, physical assault, verbal assault, drug use on the job, theft, any kind of sabotage, and these are common things. Unfortunately, people do them because they're mad at their employer or they're mad at their supervisor, but nonetheless, they are levels of misconduct that need to be addressed as quickly as possible. There are two basic forms of employee discipline. The first one is less common. It's called positive discipline versus what we call progressive discipline. We hear much more about progressive disciplinary policies and in the news and things like that, but positive discipline is very similar to progressive, except that it tries to, in the very beginning, focus more on counseling the employees, coaching the employees, rather than just treating it in a progressive way as a punitive measure. So if you begin in your positive disciplinary process of counseling them how to behave properly, and then you ramp up to written documentation and final warnings, it's also a form of progressive discipline. But again, we begin with this idea of how can we help the employee get over these problems. We're trying to coach them to improve. The progressive policy, or the progressive disciplinary policy, doesn't always include the counseling. It simply gives verbal cautions, written reprimands, suspensions, and discharges, and sort of you can see the punishment, if you will, or the consequences get more and more stringent as time goes on and it gets progressively harsher. And again, both of those circumstances, there is some degree of progressive process through how we warn or coach people to ultimately having to make a discharge decision. But the positive discipline is more focusing on how do we coach people to improvement before we manage to get rid of them down the line. This slide is just another visual to give you a sense of how the progressive discipline process works. And as I said, regardless of whether you're using the positive discipline or progressive discipline, both of them encourage some degree of progression from lower level intervention to a higher level intervention like suspension or discharge. And again, the goal here is you give people due process, you're giving them multiple opportunities to improve, and if they don't improve, then you've got it well documented how to get rid of them or to let them go if they don't manage the improvements as you want them to. In terms of how do we manage or administer the disciplinary process, the most important thing is that we ensure, as I said in the previous slide, due process. Due process is essential because it makes sure that everybody's treated fairly and everybody is treated consistently. And it also encourages to make sure that we have appropriate standards, that everybody's clear about what those standards are, and that everybody has the opportunity to appeal. So some of the basic standards for discipline is ensuring up front that we communicate all the rules and all the criteria so there's no second guessing what's expected. Then we have to make sure that we fairly document all the facts of the case, and then ultimately make sure we respond in a very consistent manner to the rule violations. If we have, the progressive discipline or the positive discipline, that we are clearly following those rules and it's well documented that we're doing so. The most important thing with discipline is really the consistency and the fairness that has to be attached to it. In the just cause standard of discipline, what we're trying to do is ensure that we keep a set procedure that we follow. We have to make sure we notify the individual who's violated the rules, make sure that the violation and the expectation is reasonable. It's reasonable to expect someone to come into work at 9 o'clock every day. It's unreasonable to punish them if they come in at 9:01 or 9:02. Right? So, we want to keep things within the range of reasonable so that we aren't looked at as retaliating or being petty. And that can happen in organizations. Organizations very often will go after someone and try to be petty and say, well, you came in at 9:02 every day, so, we're going to fire you. And usually that's done in retaliation for whistleblowing or something along that line. That's another story and another lecture. Other things that need to happen with the just cause standard of discipline is that we need to investigate, and we need to make sure that that investigation is fair. We need to make sure that there is a good solid proof of guilt. Again, we need to make sure that there's all sorts of evidence pointing in that direction, because again, if we have to go to court, we have to be able to justify that if the person sues us for unfair firing or discrimination at some level. We need to make sure that we have good solid proof and that we are very clear in our process and in our own thoughts and minds that we are not going after someone simply for reasons of illegal discrimination, for race, sex, religion, age, disability, you name it. We want to make sure that there's a reasonable penalty for the violation. If someone is absent one day and they don't call in, do you fire them right away or do we intervene? And while we might be within our legal rights to fire someone, if you have to consider that sometimes people have bad days, sometimes people aren't always as predictable as we'd like them to be. If you've already invested in this employee and they are a good performer, then your goal, of course, is to try to retain workers as best as you can, to give them the benefit of the doubt up front first. And the more that you can do that for them, the more that other employees see that you are being as fair as possible to people and that you're not a zero tolerance kind of organization that says, okay, you did it, you're done, we're moving on. You violated the policy once and now you're out of here. And that is not always comfortable for organizations and for people. The last thing, of course, is making sure we have that right to appeal. Again, we don't know if the disciplinary process may be biased in and of itself, so there has to always be an appeal process embedded in your disciplinary procedure. People have to be able to say, I think that's unfair, I think that's not true, and here I want to appeal the decision and be able to say this is, what I think would be more fair. I think this is a great list of things to really be aware of if you're trying to discipline somebody. The first thing always is to make sure that you are in control of your temper. You're probably going to be very angry with an employee if they've really consistently violated the rules. And so the last thing you want to do is let them poke you and prod you so that you lose your temper, which might negate the discipline that you're engaging in the first place. So your goal, of course, is to make sure you keep cool and calm, that you aren't losing your temper, you're keeping the person focused on the issues at hand, you're not letting them distract you. That's key. The next issue is just ignoring disciplinary issues entirely. You see somebody making rule violations and you choose not to follow up on it. You choose not to point it out. And there may be a whole host of reasons why you don't want to do that, because you want to be friends, or you want people to like you, or you just don't care. That doesn't help the organization either. So you want to make sure that when you see a disciplinary issue, you act on it right away. You don't want to make excuses for that employee also, because you say, well, they're having a bad day, so I'm just going to forget it. Or, well, they're really a nice person and they're a really good performer, so we'll ignore the fact that they're sexually harassing people. That will never fly in a court of law. The court's going to come after you, and they'll probably double the fine. Well, maybe not, but they'll certainly draw attention to the fact that you were making excuses or rationalizing the bad behavior, and you can never really do that, certainly not within the court of law. The last thing I want to point out is this idea of being a therapist. You're not a therapist. You're not there to solve the person's problems. You're there as their coach, or you're there as the HR professional who's engaged in the disciplinary process, supporting the manager who might be having to do the discipline. And the goal here is you don't want to be the psychiatrist that's working through their problems in their childhood, and and how people didn't like them growing up, and trying to say, well, now if you just go to therapy and people will like you better. Your goal is not to be a therapist. Your goal is to make it really clear what behaviors they're engaged in, why they're wrong, and what they need to do to make that change. So focus on the behaviors, explain what the impact is, make sure that they're clear what they need to do differently, setting expectations, and then lastly, let them know, this is what's going to happen if you don't make it work. So don't play therapist. Don't try to get into the psychology of why they're doing things. That's not your job. If they need to go to a therapist, they need to go to a therapist on their own. That's not your job as their boss or as their HR professional. The next few slides are some really good slides addressing the different kinds of performance problems or disciplinary problems we may be having. One might be poor attendance, and sort of what are the questions that we should be asking, and what are the things that we need to think about in terms of mitigating circumstances. It's always important that we spend some time at least trying to understand what the reasons are for why people are engaging in certain types of behavior, and attendance would be one of them. There is no mitigating circumstance for why someone would sexually harass somebody else, but certainly there can be a mitigating circumstance of why there's poor attendance, or why there's, other sort of issues showing up late, or things like that. So, let's investigate why the problems are existing and why the behaviors are existing, and then helping them to understand why those behaviors are inappropriate, and then creating the expectations, the new expectations of what needs to be done and why. So again, if someone has consistent problems, remember, if someone has consistent problems with discipline, and with attendance, it's our job to make sure that they are managed. It's our job to make sure that they do show up on time as often as we need them to be. They don't get to come in at their leisure, but we also need to at least take into account where there may be, again, some mitigating circumstances, some problems in terms of juggling priorities in their life. That's the goal. Other aspects of managing the difficult employees, as I said, could be poor performance, or could be things like insubordination, or, like I said, things like sexual harassment and stuff like that. With poor performance, it's really not a disciplinary issue. This is about a performance management issue. We go back to meeting with the employee, letting them know why their performance is poor, and this should be embedded in a performance management or performance appraisal process. So we, in our performance appraisal process, we should have regular investigations about when employees are varying from their level of performance that we expect of them, and have an intervention right away. So, so the goal here is figure out what the reasons are for the poor performance. Is it motivation? Is it training? Is it poor resources? It could be any number of different things. If we go back to expectancy theory and we consider, that in order to be a good performer, they have to have motivation, ability, and organizational resources. Without resources, they can't do their job. Without the ability, they can't do the job. Maybe they need to be trained, or maybe they're just not motivated. Maybe they just don't care about it, in which case then there's not much you can do. there's only so much you can do to manage the motivation side. The insubordination, that's a bigger issue. That doesn't get any mitigating factors. If someone does not carry out a management directive, the most important thing is to recognize, accept, that that's a no-go. You always follow directions, except for two rules of thumb, as it says there. You cannot order someone to do something illegal, because then the law will be on their side. You cannot order someone to be unsafe. And so if you're telling them to be unsafe, you don't get to do that. They have the right to say, no, I will not work unsafe. You can try to fire them, but the court will still rule in their favor. So it's not worth even trying to fire them. So other than those two exceptions, ordering someone to do something illegal, ordering someone to work unsafe, you have to follow management directives. And if they don't, you either come to an agreement with management why you are not comfortable doing it, or you could be fired for insubordination. And you may lose things like unemployment compensation and things like that, because insubordination certainly is one of those reasons that we could certainly fire you and not have to pay unemployment comp on you, because that's a gross misconduct. The last issues we want to talk about in terms of disciplinary issues and how we manage difficult employees is the issues of workplace bullying, as well as alcohol and illegal drug use. And of course, bullying is a form of harassment. I know that this lecture slide says developing zero tolerance policies for bullying, and I think we need to be careful about what that zero tolerance policy means. A zero tolerance policy is fine if the person is found guilty and there is absolute definable evidence that someone was engaged in bullying, and therefore, yes, we can make a decision that bullying is not acceptable and you will lose your job. But I have problems with zero tolerance policies that don't allow for people to defend themselves through due process. So going back to those first few slides where we talked about the importance of due process, it's imperative that we ensure that there's a due process procedure in place, so that if we are saying that there is no tolerance for bullying and you will lose your job, we need to make sure that we've done a proper investigation and we have all the solid evidence and we've done a hearing and we have all the support we need, and then zero tolerance policies can go in place at that context. But we do have to give people an opportunity to defend themselves, to have due process. Otherwise, a zero tolerance policy is not appropriate. Lastly, of course, is this issue of alcohol and drug use. Sometimes we see that embedded in workplace behaviors where they may be slowing down in terms of their performance, or they don't attend well. You could, by law, certainly fire somebody for alcohol and drug use, illegal drug use on the job. The right response, however, is that what we really need to do is make sure that we have investigated to see what we can do to help this employee. I'm not talking about being a therapist for them. That you cannot do. But you can say, we have an employee assistance program. If you want to keep your job, we need you to attend the EAP. We need you to go to get Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or what have you, whatever program was appropriate. Making sure that we've got a system in place to be able to help people improve. If someone is a recovering alcoholic and a recovering drug user, they are covered under the ADA. But if they are not recovering, they certainly can run the risk of getting fired. So I think it's really important that we do our best to retain good employees if they were good employees. If they've been lousy employees from day one, of course we don't want to retain them. But if we have good employees that we've had for a while that have made contributions, we absolutely want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to get them walking on the straight and narrow. And that's not an easy thing to do. If anybody's ever tried to help an alcoholic or a drug abuser get sober, we know it's not an easy process. Sometimes they have to hit the rock bottom. Again, that's not your responsibility as an HR professional, as a boss. It's your responsibility to help that person get help, and if they refuse that help, you certainly are within your rights to let them go. And try to use a progressive disciplinary policy to help them to get off that drugs and alcohol and work their way towards recovery. This next slide talks about how we can avoid or prevent the need for discipline. And I agree with these conclusions here that we can minimize the need for discipline. We're never going to get rid of it, but we can minimize the need for discipline if we recruit and hire good employees, that we train them and develop them and we invest in them. If we are doing a good job with planning and making sure that we are not overworking or overtaxing our employees, that we give them good feedback through a good, fair performance appraisal process, and we pay them fairly. If we do good in all the other HR areas, this will minimize our need for discipline because people will be motivated, people will have good resources, people will have a good paying job, they'll get good feedback, they'll get constructive feedback, they'll be able to work to the best of their abilities. If we take an employee-centered approach and making sure that our employees have all that they need and can do all that they're capable of doing, providing them with the support to do that, you'll have very little need for discipline. It's when we treat employees like they are lazy and horrible and they don't care about work, they'll live up to those expectations, and then they will need issues with discipline. So, if you believe that your workers are going to work hard and they're going to work strong, then they'll live up to that. If you believe that they're lazy, they will work down to that, absolutely. So work hard to do all the right things in the other areas of HR, and hopefully you will be able to minimize your need for a discipline program. So there are a number of different reasons why managers don't like to use discipline, and we certainly, a few slides before, I discussed the idea that fear of losing friendship or fear of just not being interested and you don't care. There's a whole lot of different reasons why managers won't discipline employees, and some of it is because they fear there'll be a lawsuit. Other times is it takes up too much time to discipline people, so since it takes up so much time, it's just easier to just do the work yourself and let it slide, and of course that comes back to hurt you in the long run. You might have a company culture that just avoids discipline even if you want to do it. So that puts pressure on you not to engage in disciplinary procedures. You might also have a situation where you don't get the support from higher management, or that you did those things in the past, so therefore you feel a little guilty for complaining to someone that they are not coming in on time, or they're stealing, pencils from the company, supply closet, whatever. And then, as I said, before, this fear of losing a friendship, but again, as a manager, you're not their friend. You can be friendly, but you are still their boss. You are responsible for making sure they do the work. And if you don't ensure they do the work, then that comes back to reflect poorly on you. So investing in the time to do discipline is really important, whether you're interfering with performance management issues or whether you're interfering with policy violations. It's really essential that you don't shirk that duty and actually follow through on what you say you're going to do, and make sure people understand that when you violate a policy, there's a consequence for it.